The medication almost killed my dad. He's a psychologist, and even he wasn't aware of how bad these medications are for some people. Why? Why wasn't he aware? This is the single biggest news story in the last 50 years of both psychiatry and psychology. The specific symptom that Dr. Jordan Peterson is struggling with is called akathisia. Akathisia is a symptom that kills people because it is so hard to endure, it is so hard to live with, that they tend to commit suicide. I'm now going to show you a short clip of a woman suffering from akathisia. This specific woman, her family members have discussed her case on the internet. This specific woman did end her life in suicide.
Where are you going? Huh? You gonna be okay? It'll pass.
I was not born wise. I was born ignorant like everyone else. I had to learn these things through hard work. However, that process of learning, for me, begins and ends with sympathy. I don't sympathize with other people just to make myself feel morally superior. Sympathy is an analytical tool. Sympathy is part of understanding the world, and sympathy is a crucial part of the process of curiosity. You get interested in why other people are suffering, what they're suffering from, what their problems are, and how to solve them. Sympathy leads you into learning about many important phenomena in life, and this is one. Even though I myself have never taken SSRI antidepressants, I myself have never taken benzodiazepines or any of these drugs, I nevertheless know that this is a major important question in our society, and it's an important question specifically in the academic discipline that Dr. Jordan Peterson was supposedly a master of. Quote, directly quoting his idiot diet guru daughter, "This was not a case of psychological addiction. Benzodiazepine physical dependence due to the brain changes that can occur in a matter of weeks can destroy lives." Yeah, what? Just imagine if Dr. Jordan Peterson had been an activist on this issue before it destroyed his life. Imagine if he had any sympathy for or interest in his own patients whatsoever. Imagine if he had any interest in what was happening in the state of the art of his own field of medical science and treatment. Nope.
So as you guys might have heard, Jordan Peterson is back in the news in a big way because he's in Russia now with brain damage. He went to some kind of shady Russian medical facility, Russian rehab, where they put you in a medically induced coma so that you don't have to deal with the symptoms of withdrawal. And I guess that he awoke from that coma with brain damage. And this is to deal with his addiction to, I don't even know what he was addicted to.
Imagine if he had any sympathy for or interest in his own patients whatsoever. Imagine if he had any interest in what was happening in the state of the art of his own field of medical science and treatment. Nope. He wanted to write books about lobsters and why everyone should believe in Jesus to make society a better place. He wanted to rail against the use of gender-neutral pronouns in the English language. He had other priorities rather than dealing with, the reality of these psychiatric drugs and their side effects, even though that was his field. That was what he lectured on at university, and that was what he recommended his patients do. I've quoted him on that in prior videos in the past.
I've heard depressed people who stopped antidepressants said they never helped in the first place. What do you say to that, Mr. Peterson? Hey, that's certainly possible. Antidepressants don't necessarily work for everyone. My personal opinion is that antidepressants work quite well for many people whose lives are in decent order. So they have friends, they have family that love them, they have a career, they're educated approximately to the level of their intelligence.
He recommended that all his patients get on SSRI antidepressants. It was a common thing for him in his practice. He'd have to counsel them and convince them to overcome their hesitancy, their reluctance to taking these drugs that have been debunked as not having a positive effect, and drugs that have been proven to have really dangerous, really terrifying side effects.
Man, what if you had diabetes? You're not going to take your insulin? It's like you got stressed, you blew out at your weakest point. That's what happens when you get stressed. If there's something out there that might help you, it's like, try it, for God's sake. You'll know in a month, and you just stop if it doesn't work. Especially for people whose lives are together and who are depressed. Antidepressants can be absolutely miraculous. So, you know, when you hear about the clinical evidence in their favor being iffy, and that's partly because the diagnosis of depression isn't very well formulated.
It can be made even worse by paradoxical reactions that are difficult to diagnose. The medication almost killed my dad. He's a psychologist, and even he wasn't aware of how bad these medications are for some people. Why? Why wasn't he aware? This is the single biggest news story in the last 50 years of both psychiatry and psychology. Why didn't he know? Why didn't he care? I mean, the negative side effects of benzodiazepines, that's fully 50 years, more. That's an old story in, medical science. We've known about what was wrong with benzodiazepines for a long time. Now, popular awareness of the problems with antidepressants maybe only goes back to the 1980s, but the scientific research is even older than that. You can hear many lectures here on YouTube about the history of it. But when I look at this woman, so I've used this clip before on my channel, but this is really instructive in showing you what akathisia is, what it is about this that makes life so unbearable. This is a seemingly beautiful, intelligent young woman who took a very low dose of a very common SSRI antidepressant. She was on a low dose of Lexapro, very commonly prescribed, and her life has been totally destroyed. And you know what's worse? She has to live with the awareness that these horrible physical symptoms that make it impossible for her to sit down, impossible for her to stand still, impossible for her to play the piano, impossible for her to hold a pen and write for any period of time, impossible for her to sit at a computer and type. These unbelievably horrible symptoms, they're not caused by damage to her nervous system. It's not like she had a car accident that injured her neck or her spine or her arms or her legs. No! She has to live with the awareness that this is because of brain damage. This is damage in her brain that fundamentally impairs how she feels, how she thinks, how she's able to perceive and understand the world. It fundamentally changes who she is for the worse, forever. If the symptoms themselves don't drive you to suicide, the awareness of that, it's very likely to do so. What an unbelievably tragic situation to be in. And Jordan Peterson, he's had this evidence in front of him. He's had this evidence on his desk and in his department. This has been the talk of the town. This is now 2020. I mean, the last 50 years, this has been the story. This has been the debate across all of these fields. Not just biopsychology, not just in the field of biopsychiatry narrowly defined, but across all of the various forms of therapy and psychotherapy. The rise and fall of Prozac, the great hopes that were attached to SSRI antidepressant medication, and then the way in which those hopes were ultimately dashed. That has been the story of the last 50 years. So look, I say again, guys, I was born ignorant. I wasn't born knowing any of this stuff. I wasn't born wise. And I have a very clear memory of my teenage years and the various stages of stupidity and self-indulgence and ignorance I had to grow up through like everyone else. And now I had to struggle to overcome my own lack of sophistication and my own lack of knowledge about these things. But I mean, when I was a member of the Buddhist religion, I'd look around at these other people who all had their own sad stories about how Buddhism had destroyed their lives. And let's be clear, Buddhism is less dangerous than taking Prozac. It's less dangerous than SSRI drugs. It's less dangerous than benzodiazepines. And Buddhism, if we're being honest, it's less dangerous than Islam. It's less dangerous than a lot of other religions. But nevertheless, I was always aware Buddhism was a faith and a creed and a set of practices that destroyed some people's lives. And a lot of the specialists, I know a guy right now who's a PhD holding professor of Buddhism in London, England. And if he's honest with you, he can talk about the way in which Buddhism destroyed his life for decades. He was involved with a horrible cult group in England. Really sad story. And however negative an effect it had on his life, I mean, at least he got a PhD out of it and a well-paying career out of it. Terrible, terrible things happen to people's lives because they're involved in Buddhism. And I was always really sensitive to that fact and really interested in it and really engaged as a reformer, where I was looking to the future of the religion and wondering, how can we solve these problems? How can we do better? How can we make sure that the future is nothing like the past? I don't look back at what Buddhism was even in the 1960s and think, oh, we should go back to that. No, Buddhism in the 1960s was an unbelievable scam, bunch of horrible cult groups ripping off white people. I don't look at what Buddhism was in the 1860s or the 1760s. I don't look back at Buddhism 1,000 years ago and think we should get back to that. I'm willing to look at what's wrong in the religion in every period, which, by the way, in case you didn't know, historically included like slavery. Nobody wants to talk about that. There were things that were really obviously wrong with Buddhism as a religion before, the Beatles got involved in the 1960s. But what struck me was that these people, they just didn't care until it happened to them. And even when it did happen to them, they only remained sympathetically engaged with their own personal tragedy. And I had to ask, how can you be so selfish? It's like looking at Jordan Peterson and wondering, how is it that you only care about your own brain damage? You don't care when you're literally recommending your own clients, your own patients, your own university students take these drugs that cause brain damage, that cause these horrifying side effects, these drugs that cause a higher rate of suicide than treatment without the drugs, treating depression just through talk therapy. These drugs that have like such a terrifying list of side effects, even just printed on the label, let alone if you do some research as a specialist with a PhD, which is what Jordan Peterson's supposed to be. How is it possible that you don't care unless and until this brain damage happens to you? And that even when it does happen, you remain so selfish that you're narrowly focused only on your own tragedy, that you have no concern about the future of your religion, of the future of your community, the future of your movement, that you just fundamentally don't sympathize with anyone else's suffering, and therefore you don't analyze other people's suffering, you don't learn from it.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.